Good evening. You have reached the No Name Cinema Society, the film review show that dares to dig just a little bit deeper. It is Thursday, July 22nd, 2021. And this is episode 65.3. It's our classic movie discussion. And tonight we're going to discuss the controversial 1970 film El Topo from director Alexander Jodorowsky. Hi, everybody. My name is Jonathan Betzler. I'm one of your hosts here for this evening, back here at my home in Los Angeles with my buddy Bogey, after being in New York a week or so ago. It has become a tradition on our show for the first classic of the new season to look at an individual film from the year that we had just finished studying. For example, 3 years ago, our first classic was Mrs. Miniver from 1942, episode 47.3. The year after that, after we had studied 1988, we reviewed The Last Temptation of Christ in episode 54.3. And last year, our first classic was North by Northwest from 1959, after we had just finished studying that year, episode 60.3. Tonight, we will be digging deeper on one of our more obscure 1970 films, one that didn't come up at all in our 1970 in review, and of course, I'm referring to Alexander Jodorowsky's El Topo. And I've got a couple of co-hosts to dig deeper on El Topo with me. And I just realized this is his first classic in a row. First, ladies and gentlemen, an alarmingly skilled gunfighter in search of enlightenment, Max Fano is here. He's doing
flailing arms and fingers, pointing at people as if they were guns. Boom,
as
non-visual
people as if they were guns. And our next co-host, ladies and gentlemen, you have not seen him review a movie since our first indie last year, Mono Sicius, in episode 60.2. It's Max's oft-naked young son who was left to be raised by monks. Ryan Turner is here.
Oh, that was fitting. I see what you did there.
All right, so sadly, these guys have a bit of a rivalry. Ryan and Max actually secretly hate each other in real life, because I often say how Max is one of the best actors alive, and Ryan always says, well, he's probably only fourth or fifth best, which Max always thought was really upsetting. Ryan was like, I'm never going to cast you in anything. I'm only going to work with the four actors that are better than you.
I just missed it by one, right?
There's always four roles.
And I'm always naked when I show up on set.
Yeah, that doesn't help.
Well, it depends on who you talk to about it. It inspires me, Max, when you do that. So it should be a very interesting, controversial discussion tonight. Speaking of controversial, here's our schedule for this, our 65th series episode. It started last Thursday, July 15th, with the review of the Marvel film Black Widow. This past Monday, July 19th, was our Indie Spotlight, the 2016 film Christine. Of course, tonight is our classic movie discussion of El Topo. And this upcoming Monday, July 26th, will be our 49th Sound Off, in which I'm going to do a book review. We're going to do a tweet beat, in which we're going to answer a lot of your questions related to our finale episodes, top 10 of 2020, 1970 in review, etc. And Matt Polis and I will be counting down our top 5 films of 1970. And that is coming up this Monday on the Sound Off. You guys don't usually drink with me. Is anybody else imbibing alcohol with me?
I have a, milk stout, which is by milk stout, I mean actual coffee.
Yeah, that's what I figured. I got Lagunitas. Max, you got water? Yeah.
Vodka.
You guys are losers. Vodka and a water bottle. Nice. I appreciate the effort. Here, while I'm opening my Lagunitas, take a look at our drinking game slide. You guys, the fans, sent on all these suggestions on what we do on the show that makes you guys want to drink. We consolidated it into this slide so you all can play along with Society drinking game. Ryan isn't on the show as much, so he didn't get on the list. But you guys are supposed to drink anytime I say all time, contrivance, contrived, or verisimilitude. And anytime Max does mime or a funny voice, you're supposed to drink.
Oh, no. Hello, everybody.
That wasn't his best mime, but I'm drinking anyway.
Yeah, well, we're the best voice.
So, cheers. Cheers to those of you out in the audience that are drinking along with me. All right, so now it's time for the trivia. When we did our last classic was one that Max is on. We did the Jolson story at the end of last season. And I gave this trivia, and I mentioned that it was our tradition to have the first classic of the year be one of the films from the year that we studied the year before, which this past year was 1970. So our first classic of the new season would be a very controversial Mexican Western from a Chilean director who claims to have raped an actress live on camera during one of the scenes in the film. Of course, referring to Alexander Jodorowsky. Now, quite recently, and most importantly, after I screened the film in 2019, Jodorowsky walked back that claim. In 2019, he said, and I quote, "They were words, not facts. Surrealist publicity in order to enter the world of cinema from a position of obscurity. I acknowledge that this statement is problematic in that it presents fictional violence against women as a tool for exposure, and now 50 years later, I regret that this is being read as truth." And before anyone asks me, the actress in question, Mara Lorenzio, has never spoken publicly about it. And every 2019 article written that I saw claimed that she could not be tracked down. No one can find her to get a comment. True or not, the story of the rape has followed the film around, but only recently has it affected the admiration and respect for Jodorowsky. His 2019 comments were due to a retrospective being canceled in New York after some protests called out his proud claims of on-screen rape.
I read that heard that he took that claim back. I didn't know how recent it was. That's a long time for people to think that.
It was recent because the claims resurfaced during retrospectives, and then they canceled retrospectives, and so he responded to the canceled retrospective. Max, you ready for a summary?
Yeah.
How to summarize El Topo, I don't know, but I'm going to try it. El Topo, which means the mole, is the picaresque journey of the titular character's younger days as a gunfighter to his attempted reformation to find peace and happiness in the simple pleasures of life and freedom. I try to be fairly vague, guys. It's clearly not my best summary. Do you guys object to it thoroughly, or
no?
Good
I
enough?
don't object to it. I think it did the job.
Pretty good,
All right.
actually. Yeah.
Oh, thanks, Max. I like the positive reinforcement from Max. Going forward, I've decided to do screening notes before opening thoughts moving forward, because I always put the screening notes in between their opening thoughts and mine, and it's awkward. And this way, I feel like I can set the stage. So I screened this film on March 31st, 2019. And I was surprised by how much of the audience liked the film. It's a challenging piece. Strangely, as the discussion went on, it became clear that there was a lot of the film that they actually didn't understand. For example, no one realized that the monk at the end was the son of El Topo. They also didn't realize that he was the same guy that was reborn. They didn't realize it was the same guy El Topo was. They thought it was a whole different movie when he wakes up in the cave. But they enjoyed the film anyway. They said that there was a constant and emotional through line that kept them invested. And another said that they'll be thinking about this movie for days. So it had its impact, and that was the audience. And I was nervous to screen the film, but it went over very well initially, and I'll get to that in a second, because I did not reveal the context of some of the backstory before screening it. Had anybody seen or heard of the film?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think I've seen the title connected to the director, but I didn't know anything about it.
Okay, cool. But no one had seen it before.
I hadn't seen it, no.
I second that motion.
So it's the first time. Ryan, first time viewing. What did you think?
A metaphorical movie that I could see why people like it, but it's not necessarily my cup of tea.
I didn't expect it to be your cup of tea, but I did think it might be a Max kind of a movie. Max, what did you think? Your opening thought?
Oh my God. It really, obviously it's an experimental film. Obviously, it's abstract in its nature. I didn't get very emotionally invested. I thought it was very presentational and very thematic. Super disturbing, an amazing, terrible film, or a terrible, amazing film.
So my opening thought, in spite of my audience liking it, I kind of didn't enjoy it. So much so that I didn't really bother to rewatch it for this evening. It's one of the first times I've done that. The screening was only a couple years ago, and I recorded the conversation afterwards, the talk back on audio, and I took copious notes. So I'm going to do the show based on those without having rewatched it, and we'll see. We'll see how that works. So I wonder, I don't know if we want to discuss it first or not, but I do want to bring up some context here because I mentioned in the trivia about some of the behind the scenes allegations, and it's unclear whether that story is true or not. I will say that I did reveal the story about the rape after we did the vote at the screening. One of the attendees of the screening in March 2019 was Society member Alex, who was the most effusive supporter of the film that night. He loved it and at one point called it a masterpiece, but changed his mind when I revealed the story about the alleged rape. He was actually scheduled to do this show initially, but not only refused, is no longer a part of the show in general as a protest to us even discussing the film. So this brings up a long debated topic, and I don't want to go too far down a rabbit hole, but I do want to address the elephant in the room as I merge a couple animal-based idioms there. To me, a work of art is ultimately independent from the people behind it, the off-camera behavior, and in some cases, how they achieve their art. That doesn't condone bad behavior on set, on the contrary. But for me, once it's out there, it's a separate situation. I can like the result without liking the means. In this case, I don't like the movie that much, which we'll get to, but it has nothing to do with the backstory, which may not even be true. It might even just be apocryphal, and I'm more inclined to believe that, but that might be another discussion. So I wanted to open up to you guys. Does this story I mean, Ryan, you had read about the story. Was it before or after the film you read about the story?
After the film, because after the film I kind of was really curious about. I mean, it's a very symbolic and metaphorical movie, so I was just kind of like diving into what I missed and to making some meaning out of the stuff that I didn't really make meaning out of when I watched it. But yeah, I mean, I think I saw it with also him saying that wasn't real, that was used for publicity. I actually saw Jodorowsky's Dune documentary.
The documentary about his failed attempt to make Dune, just for the audience's sake.
Yeah, so that's how I'd heard about this in Holy Mountain, which I thought that documentary was incredible. It's like a really incredible. I would say I did enjoy the documentary a lot more than watching his films. In terms of his stunt with the rape, obviously that's completely uncalled for and deserves the backlash he gets when they're talking about it because that's very exploitative. I agree with you, though. I think it's, discussing something like that is, I think, important to talk about. So
the documentary, Jodorowsky's Dune, where you get to know him a little bit, it sort of makes me more inclined to believe that it was a publicity stunt. You get a sense of him as a person. You're like, yeah, that makes more sense that it's a publicity stunt. Max, where do you land on all this?
I'm hearing this for the first time. I didn't know anything about it. I knew of his visual style from trailers and posters and things. So that's really unsettling because I thought so many of the visuals were so real. That scene, I think, that you're referring to in particular, makes me really disturbed about this guy in the movie. But I don't. It does seem like he's a director searching for flair.
Well, even in the film, there's a certain element of shock value. Like sometimes there are images that I felt like were merely there for shock value. Again,
Absolutely.
Why I'm more inclined to believe that his comments were false and he just said them to shock people.
Although doing something like that would qualify as shock value as well. I mean,
I don't know if this is true or not, but apparently he did kill the rabbits in that scene.
Yeah, for sure.
He said he karate chopped them.
I didn't hear about the karate chopping. That I don't believe. Can you separate what's happened behind the scenes, the man versus the end product?
That's a really good question. I'm having a hard time with that one because this particular film seems so sort of experiential. I mean, everybody involved was so gung-ho that it really kind of looked like he was taking them through this exodus through the countryside. I'm left feeling a little disturbed.
I mean, it's a very complicated situation. Say someone makes music or makes movies that positively impact the world and change the world for the better, but then the person themselves did terrible things in their off-camera life. It's a very interesting discussion. It's worth talking about the nuance of those two things because I don't necessarily think they're fully separate. I think you have to take one with the other, but you also can there's positive that could come from a negative person in life. You know what I mean? So it's interesting. It's an interesting discussion. I don't think there's like a black and white situation.
Like this is an extreme situation. Rape was bad and always bad. But I mean, like bad behavior, like chauvinism and sexism, what we talked about on Jolson's story, racism was part of the culture in previous eras. And so to retroactively judge artists feels unfair when they were, when their behavior within the context of their own time period was not considered off or wrong. Once you get to a certain point in history, they live on their own, to me personally. But it seems very individual.
I think there's a difference, though, JB, in terms of, making somebody else's life miserable and making them suffer.
This is an extreme example, if it were true, which we're not even sure that it is. But it does bring up the question because, the audience loved the film when I showed it to them. Some of them all of a sudden didn't.
Yeah.
It had nothing to do with what was on screen. You guys are good. I'm going to move on so we can talk about the actual what is on screen. We always try to start positive. And, I will say, and Max has alluded to this, I think, the images in the film are often striking and rich in spite of what I perceive to be a low budget. I thought the framing was great and evocative, if not always comfortable. I saw elements of Buñuel in the shot ideas and juxtapositions, specifically Un Chien Andalou, film he made with Salvador Dali. And there's some elements of the film that we may now consider Lynchian. Interesting that Lynch would then take over Dune. But for me, as a primarily narrative filmmaker, that only holds my interest for so long. So guys, the visuals of the film, Max, you had mentioned it a little bit.
Amazing. I mean, the wide shots with the desert, the locations, the buildings, it was just really kind of mesmerizing in that visual sense.
Ryan.
There's a massive list of people that reference this movie as an influence to them. I think visually it's definitely very striking. That's one of the biggest things this film has, this kind of visual experience that you go through, and very symbolic, very metaphorical. very biblical.
Did you notice the biblical reference?
Lots of cross references. It's very, very striking. And I think also looking at it through the lens of the time, I can see why it's crazy how desensitized we were getting to violence. But at the time, I can imagine this being even more intense and more visceral.
You say we're desensitized, but actually the audience in 2019, and for me, it felt excessive even by today's standards, at least for me. Often the action defied logic, often unnecessarily gory and excessive, almost exploitative, and not fun or cool like some violence that we're used to, like in Tarantino or some 80s action films. And possibly the point was to echo the violence that's talked about in the Bible, but I still found it kind of a turn off to watch. The brutality was a disconnect for me. It affected me in a negative way. Regardless of its meaning, I actually didn't find it cool or fun, like violence can sometimes be if done under the right context. Ryan, I didn't enjoy it regardless.
No, I didn't enjoy I don't generally enjoy violence on screen.
The violence was really, really uncomfortable. The whole experience was really hard to watch in terms of how many people died, in terms of the sort of iconography of it, where he is destroying a storybook version of what we understand is the biblical tradition or something, where the savior is actually evil.
Yeah, and also deconstructing mythology of the Old West.
Yeah,
was an element to that.
Really, really gnarly. I was not excited by the violence.
So I did want to call out, we don't talk about it that much on the show, unless we have Matt Polis, the sound designer here, but I do want to call out the sound design, talking about positive things. It was a thorough and detailed soundscape. One person at the screening called it charmingly awful, and what I interpreted that to mean is intentionally dissonant. It didn't sound good to the ears, but it seemed to work in terms of enhancing the mood and tone. Did anybody notice the sound design? I don't know how you could have.
Yeah,
I definitely noticed the sound design. It was super uncomfortable, very harsh to listen to, and very interesting uses of sound effects to categorize different things, and even just the voices. The
contrast women's voices with men.
Exactly, yeah. That kind of element was very jarring, but the sound itself was very in your face. I think there was the one with the mother and, what was it, the second guy? He had the little intricate crafts. When she stepped on the mirror, and I forgot the sound that it made. It was like this weird cooing or something. I was like, what is happening? Is something playing on my computer accidentally? That's the kind of thing that the whole movie felt like. It sounds like that you're like, whoa.
Constantly playing with ideas. Like there's a scene where another rape, a fake rape in the case, where it's a bunch of old women raping a black man, but using male voices as the old women, which can be interpreted 1,000 different ways. I didn't want to unpack it, but I bring it up to point out another, sort of out there, unusual use of sound design to further a point or make a point, whatever that point may be. Anything on sound design, Max?
Lots on sound design, but I'll be brief. Loud and disturbing. Loud and disturbing.
Yeah, definitely.
I was expecting to pull out like a notebook on sound design. I don't have a lot to say about the performances. Max brought them a little bit. I wouldn't call them good performances, but it sounds like Max admired them. But I will say that they are pretty much on point with the style. They're not really playing dimensional characters. They're playing archetypes or symbols. And as I just mentioned, Joe Dorowski often dubbed actors with different voices, intentionally very different, which sort of, to me, Max takes the craft out of the acting to some degree. So I don't really know how to respond to the performances or evaluate them, except to just say like they fit within the world, I guess.
Understand me, though, I didn't actually say that the major performances were good. I thought everyone who basically had any lines was not very good. But the secondary and tertiary, the people in the background, were incredible, because you had these people throwing themselves at the leads and dying with such fervor, and their whole experience was so committed.
I like how Max merged the words verve and fervor. It made it fervor.
And verve. I am a townsperson. I am here. Whatever's going on, I'm committing to. That I thought was incredible.
Ryan, anything on the performances?
Viewing the actors as like vessels for his story, I feel like if you gave, say, people that were maybe more in tune with the craft would that have changed the experience of the movie? I feel like he's creating an experience that you're going through, and I don't necessarily feel like there was anything that didn't ring as true within those experiences. The performances served his story, and it's already surrealist enough that, like, yeah, it's hard to even discern between whether this is motivated performances or whether that is serving what he's trying to do. Like, just even like the guys that were acting like dogs and riding iguanas, how are you going to do that and make that grounded? I don't think there's a way in that world. I don't think that that's even what he wanted. Yeah, I feel like this is the kind of movie where it's all about that experience that he's serving to you. Playing the lead role himself, yeah, he was committed. You replace him with a more experienced actor, it probably would have grounded in more plot, which is probably not even what he wants to do. So,
can you imagine Clint Eastwood as El Topo? That'd be a different whole experience. I would still want to cast trained actors. Like, maybe I'm an elitist like that. Ryan calls me an elitist all the time, but for very different reasons.
JB, he was calling you El Litis.
I don't even know what that means, but it makes me laugh. That'll bring me to the screenplay. Ryan's like, where's he going to go with the screenplay? And I mean, obviously the screenplay is thin on plot and long on allegory. It does seem to have a plot of sorts. And while I seem to understand it, as I said, none of the other audience members did. And also, it seemed to prioritize allegory over narrative storytelling, which is fine. But as far as I was concerned, sometimes I felt the symbolism and iconography was obvious, unfocused, and to some degree a little salacious, as if for shock value. And that's something I was sort of saying to Ryan earlier. Some moments reminded me of the kind of thing that film students that I would go to school with used to try when attempting symbolism, and it comes off as clunky and not super impactful, like the sexual fruit or the rather obvious Christian imagery, even quoting the Bible throughout. It's a bit muddled too, because at one point he's a Christ figure, El Topo, and then he's a Moses figure. It's sort of like all over the place, as if they had a lot of ideas, threw them at the wall, and perhaps some of them stuck. As impressive as it is that the film wants to be about so much, I often wonder if it was almost too ambitious in its thematic aspirations. It's one of those films where everything seems intentional, but not necessarily controlled. Without getting, obviously we have a section on the themes coming up. So without getting in the individual themes, I'm curious how you guys respond to my comments that maybe went a little too far, Max.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, why for? I was sitting there watching going, oh my God, we have another gunfighter master to kill. This is really unnecessary. And one thing that saved some of the script and the story for me, there were very surprising elements. Humor being brought in when you expected more violence, and then, of course, endless violence when you expected some humor.
But I mean, there's something to that, constantly playing with your expectations.
Yes, but that's not a story. That's like an exercise.
I agree.
Prolonged exercise, which had some success to it because it could hold your attention, albeit painfully.
When I said it's not necessarily a type of film that I super enjoy, is just purely because I feel like films that live exclusively in that symbolic, metaphorical world where you have to be unpacking symbolism while watching because the plot itself is not enough to drive you. It's a choice. He's going for that experience. And I think, again, like, he's going for shock value. He's going for these very strong, visceral experiences and experimenting with different things in the edit. It is a movie that will stick with you, I think, where the experience of viewing it was not necessarily fully pleasant or enjoyable, but it will be in your brain forever. It's a testament to the movie. But like you said, I can understand not necessarily wanting to view it again, because even the first viewing, I was kind of like, all right, is there a way I can just summarize this movie without having to go through this?
On one level, it makes you work harder. Sometimes the allegorical movies, you're a bit of a detective, which I can enjoy. And, this will get me banned from ever getting a job at the Criterion Collection. But I feel like in this particular case, individual
You were already
scenes
out of the running, JB. Don't worry.
Individual scenes meant things, but I actually don't feel like there was a cohesion. I
don't think there was a cohesion either.
Coherency is not there. You're right.
There wasn't a cohesive message. And that's why I think, as far as symbolism is concerned, he didn't have an overall point. He just had little things that he wanted to do that amused him in certain scenes. It might be blasphemous to sort of suggest that a revered film like this was kind of too all over the place for its own good, but that's sort of how I feel like. I feel like, yes, there is a lot of symbolism, but it's not cogent. There was a lot of ideas, but not an overall theme to it. I guess that's my main issue with it, is I do feel like there wasn't a through line.
I think what you're saying is really interesting, JB, because part of, I think, why you got where you got is the impression that the viewer gets which is not one of very much understanding. It's sort of being overwhelmed with iconography and imagery that is related but totally disparate, so that you're left emotionally disturbed and kind of intellectually confused. Whereas I think the theme, the direction of something that is more depth laden, like he's really mining some universal themes and some things that connect to history, that stuff doesn't really come through.
There's something almost young and immature about it. Like, playing, I think, is a good word, because I think that connotes a level of immaturity and unfocusedness.
Right.
So out of curiosity, guys, I mentioned at the screening that certain plot elements, which to me were clear, but I was shocked that the audience that liked the movie, incidentally, were just over. Was everybody clear that the monk at the end was the son of El Topo?
I didn't get that. I did know that Alejandro Jodorowsky was the same guy.
Okay.
But I didn't know that was his son, actually. I was like, this guy represents the beginning, but I didn't connect that it was his son.
It was the son that he dropped off with the monks.
The little boy from the beginning who buried the toy and the photo of his mom.
After thinking it clicked, the execution could have been a lot clearer. Because, obviously the child is the next El Topo, I guess you could say.
What you guys are talking about is a good segue to one of Max's favorite segments, and Ryan seems to think there's a lot to unpack here. What's coming up now, Max?
Time out word. The T word.
The T word. Woo! Yes. Thank you very much, Max. This is the section of the show where we talk about the themes of a film. Our founder, Davey, used to hate talking about themes, thought it ruined the film, so we would dance around it, call it the T word. Segment was born. And so here we go. The movie, as Ryan suggested, might be all themes. It sounds like we're each going to have different things to say about it. Obviously, it's an existential rumination, but I'm going to frame it through the lens of desire, potentially wondering if underneath all the culture and alleged sophistication, whether or not we are all basically defined by our ID, specifically about the way that desire and religion are interwoven into our lives and are often at odds with one another. As humans, we want things, whether that be career success or sexual success, and often we find that in order to achieve whatever goals they are, we have to adversely impact the goals of others. Pure dominance or superiority over others is often a latent desire, which leads to a lot of the violence in the film. Guilt plays a role in many religions, specifically Christianity, which is a big part of this film, and that becomes another motivating factor. What I mean by that is the price of glory is that we have to live with the things that we did in order to achieve the goals that we had. And we wonder, ultimately, was it all worth it? According to the film, this vacillation between desire and regret is somewhat cyclical, both within our own selves and from generation to generation. As much as we try to pass along our experiences to the next generation, they are often reluctant to heed our warnings, and they make the same mistakes over and over again as the years go on. And maybe it's not about parenting, maybe it's just about the nature of humanity, and there's no way around it. Human nature is very bad, and it's not going to change. It's a somewhat misanthropic, almost nihilistic point of view, and I'm not sure I agree with it, but that's my interpretation. So guys, desire and how it relates to this film.
Yeah, I think that this is one of those movies, and I'll talk about, there's another movie that I saw recently that I'll talk about after this, but within the last 5 years that I think is very similar to this, which I had a much more visceral dislike of.
I just want to add, before you go too much further, I'm curious, the film that came up in our discussion was Mother by Aronofsky. Is that what you're referring to?
That's exactly the film I'm talking about.
Yeah, we made that connection as well.
It's a polarizing film, but it's a film that I disliked. I actually disliked it more than this film because I feel like Aronofsky went for the shock value. He went in his film exclusively lived as an allegory, biblical, and both symbolism. It didn't really function from plot. That to me felt like a student film with a big budget, executed very well. But Danielle, my girlfriend, when we're watching it, turns to me and Mother, and she goes, "She's Mother Nature, isn't she?" Just like so disappointed. Just like that movie, there's so many low-hanging fruit for like what that symbolism could be, and I totally see desire. To me, the film is very much about ascent, the man's journey in life to essentially what's driving men a lot of times. You know, there's like obviously the Adam and Eve situation, that I'm going to be sent on this quest. I have to go and overcome these 4 different challenges, the different masters. Each master definitely, you could argue, symbolizes different elements of life, and then obviously the master that he's not able to defeat ends up defeating himself. But again, I think that because it's such a broad target, you could throw a dart at it and you'll hit no matter what. You know what I mean? You could be like, this movie's about this, and you could make an argument for it. You could make this movie. So that's the way I see it. You could write a great paper on it because there's so many just obvious symbolism. I don't think there's going to be one catch-all where it's like every single thing lines up here.
That was the lack of coherence that I was talking about earlier. Is I do think there's not one thing that's going to be all-encompassing. And that, sadly, Ryan, is what I liked about Mother. I actually liked Aronofsky's Mother because I did feel like it was a more cohesive experience. Max, not about Mother, but about Desire and El Topo.
I mean, I see what you're both saying. I think you both made some good points. I look at this as the allegory of man's journey through life, youth, adolescence, maturity, if you will, old age, death, and then also the element of the sort of spiritual quest where one has to die unto themselves. The thing is that I see this through the guise of, JB, you said nihilism, this sort of rather self-obsessed. It's as if the story of the whole was designed by someone at the beginning in their most immature stage, rather than the story of the whole being conceptualized towards the end, where you have a different understanding of the sequences and you don't get so lost and involved in every little detail. The irony here is this guy has to kind of go through all this suffering and see how kind of evil he is, and to a certain degree helpless and nothing he is, and ultimately die unto himself, if you will, so that he can become something of value. And without having died, he's totally caught up and obsessed with the sex and the violence and all these other things. If you don't know something, but you decide to make an opus about it, this is an example of that.
I don't know if you meant that to be funny.
It is funny. And I think that's the sad case of most artistic endeavors, is we can't see absolutely everything. That's the struggle. This guy saw remarkably little, I think.
Sometimes in art, the exploration in and of itself is interesting. It doesn't. I don't necessarily need films to give me the answers, but the exploration.
True. But if he knew more, he could open up more questions. This guy was actually answering quite a lot of it because he didn't really know.
You're not wrong. And it sounds to me like you're sort of boiling it down to this existential cycle of life kind of thing. Like that's what I got from a lot of what you're saying.
Yeah, which can be found in more sequenced and more logical pieces as well.
It's about the meaning of life, and which is just why it's so unfocused, because it's not about one thing, it's about everything.
I think that's exactly true. Part and parcel with that, Alex, who, during the screening had an interesting take on it that I wanted to throw at you guys, even though he doesn't want to be on the show anymore. He called the movie about the true self, which was kind of interesting. And he said it was a meditation on the battle between the self and control or power. One has to destroy himself and his own beliefs if they got in the way of his own destiny. The constantly evolving sense of self as we go through the journey of our lives. He basically erases himself to become what he decides is acceptable, which is basically self-acceptance. I thought that was an interesting take on it. Again, my main takeaway was desire. I thought the sense of self thing was interesting. Max, anything on that?
I would agree. I think it's very much a sense of self. One thing I have to say, possibly to the film's defense, although I don't know how defensive this is, everything falls through the guise of one's own level of existence, if you will. And this guy's forte, Alexander Jodorowsky, seems to be a visceral, tactile, visual artist. He kind of flails about and grabs at things that are very real to him. He does succeed in telling his spiritual quest opus in terms of telling it from his point of view, I think. It's not a great point of view. I think it's a point of view that at this point is really tired.
What I glean from that, Max, and I'm not sure it's exactly what you meant, but it makes me think about it, is that it's almost inadvertently a reflection on or meditation on masculinity and the role of masculinity in our culture.
Well, he couldn't help but do that, because I think he's quite a bit in love with himself, and he's very much a man. And
so in that degree, there's narcissism as well in play as a potential theme. Ryan said there's so many things, and it'll never be all-encompassing, but there's certain scenes deal with gender roles, certain scenes deal with social hierarchy all of a sudden, certain scenes deal with tolerance and compassion, certain scenes deal with fate. And as I suggested earlier, it may have been too much for its own good, but it is all in there. And so there's something to be said for having all these ideas, because I don't know if it was Ryan that suggested this. It's better than movies that are just kind of there. Even some narrative movies are just point A to point B and don't have any nuance or depth to it. So at least this movie tried to say something about the human experience.
Oh, absolutely.
It's definitely a movie that you can watch and discuss and talk about life about. And so I think in that way it succeeds.
And now, guys, we're going to move on to the next section. This is a fun section that the audience really loves. We call it the Classic Movie Showdown. Whoa. I hope my neighbors aren't upset about how loud I did that. And this is where we have films go head-to-head in bracket style matchups. Tonight is going to be the bracket of the best westerns of all time. So we're going to have a couple westerns going head to head. Before I reveal the bracket, my buddy Max here is going to read to you the rules of the classics.
The rules for the Classic Movie Showdown, folks. Number 1, seeding criteria varies from bracket to bracket. Number 2, films at JB hosted screenings need to be 15 years or older, in this case, 2006. Number 3, voters are eligible if they see both films within a 12-month period. Number 4, voters must see both films in JB's presence, which is why I've never voted. Number 5, JB is ineligible to vote but breaks ties. Da-da-da.
Max, that suggests that you don't like to be around me. That's the connotation.
I'm kidding. I was just thinking, I've never voted.
Is that true? Have you never voted? I can actually confirm or deny that.
Uh-oh, maybe I have voted.
No, you have not voted ever.
JB.
You are correct. Ryan has voted twice. Well, you need to come by more often, Max.
This is true. All
right, so guys, El Topo is a 15 seed on the Western brackets. So, some of you, and Ryan, I think, knows a little college basketball. His Gauchos have played in the tournament a couple times. A 15 seed would go up against what in the first round, Ryan? Do you know?
That'd be
number
second.
2? It would be the number 2 seed. That is correct. Well done. Max, did you know that?
I did not.
All right, now you know. It always adds up to 17 in the first round. All right. So, El Topo, number 15 seed. Here's what it goes up against. In the Western bracket, El Topo versus Shane from 1953. George Stevens' film Shane. Classic Western. Probably remember Brandon O'Wild yelling after Shane, "Come back, Shane, come back." Pretty famous film, and obviously it's a high seed there. Obviously, this vote already happened at the screening in March of 2019, so the results are final, but these guys don't know the results, so I'm going to let them opine before I reveal the results. Has anybody seen Shane?
No.
Never? Max has it. Did you rewatch it for tonight, or just in life you've seen it?
I saw it a long time ago, so I did rewatch it for tonight.
Oh, very fun. I'm curious, what did you think of Shane in general?
I just think Stevens was such a masterful filmmaker. It was really a product of someone who knew what they were doing really well.
One of my favorites, and I did name George Stevens one of the best directors for our 1959 interview for his work on the Diary of Anne Frank, and also his film Woman of the Year from our 1942 interview was my number 3 film of 1942. George Stevens has long time been a favorite of mine. Max, that leaves it to you. Ryan hasn't seen Shane. What did you think if you had to vote between El Topo and Shane?
Such like apples and oranges. I was a little harsh on El Topo, largely because of its background and the director being a shock fest guy. I think there's a lot of value to the visuals and the exploration and the struggle to find new things. It doesn't stand a chance next to Shane, in my opinion. But they're so different that it's really almost like saying, I like tall grass rather than a boat or something.
If the idea is what would you rather lie down in, then yes, I would also choose tall grass over a boat. And in this case, what would you rather watch? And it sounds like you'd rather watch Shane.
I definitely derived more pleasure, more enjoyment, more emotional cohesion through Shane.
Ryan, would you rather lie down on tall grass or a boat?
Boat.
He's going with a boat. Everybody's different.
A boat can bring you out to sea, man. That could be an amazing.
Just rocks you to sleep.
He didn't say hammock on a boat. He said an actual boat.
And yeah, every boat has comfort somewhere. Even like a rowboat, you could probably lay down in.
Talk about a sidetrack. Thank you, Max. I did perpetuate it because I thought it was funny, but it's kind of fun. All right, so Max votes for Shane. I'm going to reveal now the winner of what happened in March of 2019, what the audience at my screening voted for, Shane versus El Topo, and the winner was El Topo. The 15 seed moves on. For them, it was a battle between romanticism and the counterculture, is how one person framed it. And they chose the counterculture. It was more compelling to them. One person said they liked putting the puzzle together of this movie. That was their perspective. And so El Topo moves on, and Shane, the classic Shane, is eliminated from the Westerns bracket. For those of you that have watched the show, you might remember in episode 25.3 where we did the Missouri Breaks, that Western, that movie eliminated Unforgiven. So in our Westerns bracket, Unforgiven and Shane are now out.
Which eliminated Unforgiving?
It's called the Missouri Breaks, a Western with Jack Nicholson and Marlon Brando. One of the craziest movies that you will ever see, from 1976. Ryan's looking it up now. Yeah. Currently free on YouTube with ads for those that are curious. But then the Missouri Breaks was then eliminated in the second round by a 1966 film called The Professionals. So El Topo moves on, guys. Reactions. Ryan, you were audibly reacting to that.
I mean, if you're gonna go for I haven't seen Shane, so I can't really respond to that. But I think
But you're aware of Shane's legacy.
Yeah. Not fully. I mean, I'm aware of El Topo's legacy. I think it's a movie that people are still talking about. It's a movie that stands on its own from a fiercely original perspective. So, I think I can understand why El Topo would go through. It's surprising.
Max, are you surprised?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm heartened by what Ryan just said, because I think if you have something that is film school-esque, but you push it through all the way, and maybe that's what Jodorowsky did with his El Topo, you find something. I think the whole essence of being a student and going to film school is that you're searching, but you don't really know what you're finding and where you're going and how to get there. With El Topo, maybe he really hit something with audiences over time.
It's all about taste. I'm more with you, Max, on Shane. I would have voted for Shane. And it was actually a sweep. Like, everyone voted for El Topo. I didn't vote, as you stated in the rules, but I would have voted for Shane. I appreciate things that are more character-driven, story-driven, and it effortlessly deals with important themes without sacrificing story. To Ryan's point or somebody's point, rewatchability is a factor. I could watch Shane 100 times in a week and still get something out of it. It's not a top 100 film for me. It's not like my favorite George Stevens, but it might be top 5. It's really, really strong. Even if Alan Ladd's not the greatest actor, Jack Palance is great. Van Heflin's great. I'm excited that you rewatched it for tonight.
Yeah, I was happy to.
Cool. It's time for closing thoughts. We're going to wrap things up, bringing in our evening to a close of this review of El Topo. It's been a wild and crazy evening. We've lost some society members over just talking about it. Closing thoughts, Ryan.
Yeah, I would say it's definitely a unique film experience, which is a testament to the film. I mean, it's definitely something you're not going to experience much, a film like this.
One thing I have to say is, I mean, I hope people watch this movie because it is an exploration, albeit disturbing and, very, very male, patriarchal, dominant in today's perspective. But we don't have a voice like that much, except maybe in early new filmmaking.
New filmmakers today, you mean when someone is starting being a filmmaker in any era, when they're first starting an experiment?
Raw.
I think that's what's his name, the guy who did Sex Lives and Videotape.
Soderbergh.
Yeah, he said we can sort of do nothing new. And I thought, well, that's so interesting because if you are a new filmmaker, that's the opportunity to do something new.
All right, guys, I'm going to close things out. Thank you very much. Time for trivia for the next classic that we're going to do in a month or so. It was my #1 film on the top 5 I did in episode 59.4. So you have to go back and look at that top 5, and then you'll figure out what our next class is going to be. Our next show, however, is our upcoming Sound Off with Matt Polis and Kelly, in which I'm going to do a book review. We're going to do a tweet beat, in which we're going to answer all the questions you have from our finale episodes, our top 10 of 2020, our Oscar preview, and of course, our 1970 in review. And Matt Polis and I are going to count down our top 5 films of 1970. That's coming up this Monday night. So, guys, say goodbye to the audience.
Bye.
Goodbye, audience.
Max, you've got to do it in mime. I'm just kidding. With that, ladies and
Wild
gentlemen.
wavings of hands.
With that, ladies and gentlemen, this meeting of the No Name Cinema Society is adjourned.
Nanu.